right, so we're going to focus now today. Yesterday our really focus was on the amplitude, and the amplitude affected the scale of the y-axis. All right, so A stood for amplitude. The amplitude affected the scale of the y-axis. But we didn't really touch the scale of our x-axis. Our x-axis scale stayed consistent every single time. Today we're going to learn about the period, which affects the scale of the x-axis. Okay, the period slash cycle, and that will affect the scale of the x-axis. There's a formula for the scale of the x-axis for the period, and the formula you need to learn today is 2 pi divided by the letter b. Okay, 2 pi divided by the letter b. That is called the length or the period of one trig wave, and it affects how you draw, how you label the scale of your x-axis. So yesterday we did these graphs. Y equals sine x, and we did y equals cos x. All right, that's really what we focused on. So yesterday we were changing the number out in front with the letter A. I'm going to insert that into my notes here. I'm going to put y equals A, sine x. All right, so that A changed how you labeled the y-axis. Today we're going to introduce a number by the x. We're going to call that B. So the B goes right in here. The B changes how you label the x-axis, because it changes how you label the length of the period. And so we'll do the same thing for cosine, is that we would have an A out in the front. That stands for amplitude and changes how you do the y-axis. But today we're going to introduce a B, and then that affects how you graph, how you label the x-axis. Okay, that's where the letters come from. A in front for amplitude, B will affect how the scale of the x-axis goes. All right, here's the first one I want to work on with you. Y equals sine 2x. All right, I don't want you to do really anything different in terms of drawing it. Sine starts at the origin. I'm going to really recommend that you count 4 over. So we'll count 4 tick marks over, and we'll make our dots. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so sine, these are the primary dots for sine, the 5 of them. We are going to label our y-axis like we learned yesterday, and because the amplitude here is a value of 1, we will label our y-axis with a 1 and a negative 1. So our y-axis is done. So now let's talk about labeling the x-axis. All right, the label of the x-axis is, according to the formula, 2 pi divided by b. And so I look at this equation, and I notice that b now happens to be 2. And so my period, using the formula I just taught you, is 2 pi divided by b, which is 2, which reduces to 1 pi. What that means is our labeling of our x-axis changes at the end. The beginning is always 0 pi, but the end is now 1 pi, because that is the length of the period. And so my labeling is now changing to 1 pi, the end of it. the last number. And that comes from the formula, 2 pi divided by b. So if the ending is now 1 pi, you're going to have to figure out what the other number, all the other labels need to be. So if the end is 1 pi, what should the middle be? Exactly. Right in the center should be 1/2. So 0 pi is always the beginning. The end of the formula for the period would always be the end. And then you work backwards to figure out the middle. Now figure out the one that's between 0 pi and 1/2 pi. So what's exactly in between those two numbers? 1/4. And so we label that as 1/4 pi. Which only leaves me one more thing to label, which is my dip, my lowest point. And a good rule of thumb is that that is 3 times this number right here. Okay, whatever you put there, this one is 3 times that. And so you just multiply that by 3 or triple it, and so we have 3/4. And this is the labeling for this cycle. So 3/4 pi. And then you connect the dots. And you have your nice, beautiful sine wave going there. And I would like you to go a tiny bit past and put an arrow in each direction just to show that this is an infinite graph that does continue on in that cycle, that pattern. That pattern repeats itself over and over and over again. So again, you could come up with a standard sine wave graph, copy, paste, just change the scale every single time. All right, so I'm going to try that. I am going to, oh, I can't do it on this app. Okay, I'll have to redraw it. Okay, so redraw a sine wave right underneath, or copy and paste if you've got that, and then I'm going to give you the equation, which will tell you how to label it. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, there's a sine graph. Okay, if that's the sine dots, the 5 sine dots, and this is the equation for it, y equals 2 sine 1/3 x. All right, so that's the equation. Now label it to match the equation. So the 2 tells me that my labeling on the y-axis should be 2. And now I have to figure out my labeling along the x-axis for the length of the period. So the first one at the origin, of course, is 0 pi. That doesn't change anything. But I'm going to have to use my period formula, which says take 2 pi and divide it by what number? 1/3. All right, what is 2 pi divided by 1/3? How do you divide by a fraction? So it's really 2 pi times what number? 3, which is 6 pi. So that means the end of my cycle should be labeled as 6 pi. So the beginning is always 0 pi. The end is now labeled as 6 pi, which means what about the middle, the center? 3 pi. And then what about the one between 0 pi and 3 pi? What's exactly in between there? Well, it's not right, 1.5. You're right, the decimal is, but what would be better? 3/2. Yeah, definitely fractions are better. So that's 3/2 pi. All right, and then the very last labeling is to triple the one you just did. So 3/2 pi times 3, which is 9/2 pi, or the same as 4.5, 9/2 pi. And now that's labeled. And so connect your dots and make a beautiful sine wave. I've seen some of your pictures. Yours are better than mine. Some of you really have the gift of drawing. Okay. Okay, any questions about that one so far? Okay, so the next one we're going to do is a cosine. Excuse me. So go ahead and draw a cosine graph. So that one's going to start on your y-axis. Starts at a different, and then count your 4 dots over. If you've got one that you can copy and paste, that's fine. But draw your 5 cosine dots. And I'm going to give you the equation, and then we'll label it according to the equation. So we want to make this y equals, excuse me, 1/2 cos 4x. Okay, 1/2 cos 4x. So once we have our dots in place, we know our 1/2 is going to affect the labeling on the y-axis. So that would be 1/2 here and negative 1/2 on the y-axis. We still label our origin as 0 pi. But now we need to do a little bit of math to figure out what the end of the cycle should be. So you do a little period is 2 pi divided by the number 4, which works out to be 1/2 pi. So that means the end of your cycle is labeled as 1/2 pi. So you know the beginning is 0 and the end is 1/2. Now you'll have to do a little bit of math to figure out what the center of your cycle is. If the beginning is 0 and the end is 1/2, then what's the middle? 1/4. Okay, and remember you're labeling the axis, you're not labeling the dot. Okay, you're labeling the axis position. Now what is halfway between 0 and 1/4? You got to know your fractions a little bit. What's halfway in between? 1/8, yeah. So this one is labeled as 1/8 pi, which means the last one will be triple that value, and so we label that as 3/8 pi. And then we'll draw our beautiful cosine graph, okay? Make sure that it is rounded and not with a V. And then also make sure that your ends both are curving back, pointing down to show that they are now going back down. So the ends of your arrows should not show that they're like going sideways or up. They should really show that bend, that they are curving back down again. Okay? So literally, I promise you, it's copy and paste and then just adjust your labeling every time. Okay, so one more and then we're finished. So let's do y equals -2 cosine x over 6. Now the book might write x over 6 like that. You might want to think of it more like 1/6 times x, but they're the same thing. X over 6 and 1/6 times x are the same thing. All right, so this is cosine, but it's a negative cosine. You can draw it starting upside down and then count 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so you get your cosine. I know it looks like it's going to be a triangle, but it's really a wave. And we label -2 and +2. By the way, what is the amplitude? It is +2. Okay, don't tell me it's -2. An amplitude can't be negative. An amplitude has to be the position of the highest point. And so that would still be +2. All right, the origin is labeled 0 pi. And now we want to figure out our period. So the period would say the formula is 2 pi divided by the b value, which is 1/6. And when you divide by a fraction, it's going to be 2 pi times the number 6. And so it'll be 12 pi. Okay, therefore the end of my cycle is labeled as 12 pi. So the center of the cycle is 6 pi. And then the second dot has to be 3 pi. And the fourth dot is triple that, which is 9 pi. And so you can tell it all works out perfectly. 0, 3, 6, 9, 12. Okay, it all is an equal amount. All right, and then we graph it. And nice rounded cosine wave. And then make sure the ends of it curve back up toward the x-axis again to show that the cycle continues on both sides. Okay. The domain of this is all real numbers. Every sine and cosine graph has a domain of all real numbers. The range of this has a low value of -2 and a high value of +2 because of the way the scale is drawn. Okay, that is called the range. But domain's always all real numbers for sine and cosine. It is not for tangent and cotangent, but it is for sine and cosine.